This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Well, Eli, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bob. Great to be on here.
Well, I thought maybe what we should do is what people know from the headlines and whatever, that they know we're going to be talking about SpaceX and the economics of space exploration and possibly colonization more broadly. But before we dive into that, can you just give a little bit of your own background as to, how did you get into this area?
Sure, yeah. So I'm trained as an economist. I got a PhD at George Mason University and worked at the Mercatus Center for several years in the technology policy program as the director of that program. And, got really interested in sort of non-digital technologies around 2014 or so. And sort of as part of that, sort of diving into things like aerospace generally and space in particular. I left Mercatus in 2017 to go in-house at a startup called Boom that was building a supersonic airplane. So I was head of global policy for them and worked there for almost 3 years. And now I'm at the Center for Growth and Opportunity, where I work on sort of drivers of economic growth and technology and innovation. And space is one of those areas as well.
Oh, okay. So the company was called Boom because of a sonic boom. Is that why?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Because at first I thought you were going to say like building rockets, and I was like, I don't know that I would want to work for a company building rockets called Boom. Okay, so the sonic boom makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's just an adjacent industry. Yeah.
I got you. Okay, so why don't we? The news hook, of course, is the recent launch, and so let me just. For the listeners who had the same reaction I did, I was a bit surprised. It wasn't even on my radar. I log into Twitter, as I'm wont to do. Whenever there's work that needs to be done, I first go check Twitter. And then, and I saw all these people congratulating, Elon and SpaceX or whatever for the launch, where it wasn't until several minutes of me looking around at the story that I realized it exploded. And at first I thought that was funny. And then they were even saying things like, the SpaceX is calling this a successful failure or something. I mean, and I was just chuckling to myself because I knew, like, the libertarian types who were congratulating them, if a NASA project had the exact same thing and were calling it a successful failure, they would have mocked it mercilessly. They said, "Oh yeah, like mostly peaceful riots, haha." So but then some people did send me, articles and analyses saying, "No, Bob, it's not a contradiction. Like there really is a logic to SpaceX's model here. It's sort like a fail quickly kind of thing, whereas that's not what NASA does." So can you just speak to that just a little bit for the people who also thought that was kind of humorous?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I would clarify. So this was a test flight, but Starship is a part of a NASA program, right? So it's part of the Artemis missions. It is a piece. It's going to serve, the upper stage is going to serve as the human landing system for the Artemis program. So this is related to what NASA is doing. But SpaceX takes a different philosophy than a lot of legacy aerospace companies do with regard to testing and development. So, if you look at the traditional way of procuring a rocket, right, by an agency like NASA, is to do a cost plus contract, which with a major prime contractor like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, and the NASA owns the rocket, right? They own the design. It is their product, and the incentives under that system are to design it to the nth degree, like do perfect design, fly it once, and have it go, try to have it go flawlessly. It doesn't always work that way, but that's what sort of the aerospace industry has been geared around for many decades. And SpaceX comes along and says, well, we want to own the rocket. Like we want to operate this commercially. And we want to, sell service to the government. And there have been, contracts and subsidies along the way. And their model is, let's more of an iterative rather than a linear design process. So they're going to they're going to launch, and it's not going to go perfectly, especially on the early test flights. And then they're going to learn something, they're going to figure it out, and then they're going to change some things and launch again and do better, and just increase the cycle time, between launches, and get better and better. And then sort of the first part of the launch starts going better, and maybe testing some things on the latter part of the launches. So, for example, on the Falcon 9 rocket, which is the workhorse rocket that SpaceX has, so it's not their next generation one, their current generation one. They were launching payloads into space with paying customers, and then they were trying to land the boosters right after. Mm-hmm. So they launched the rocket. The payload would separate from the booster, or the second stage would separate from the booster, and they would try to then take advantage of the fact that they had launched the booster already to try to launch it. And so then they failed a huge number of times trying to land the booster before they got it. And now they have a partially reusable rocket in the Falcon 9 that has made their costs so much lower than anybody else that could be considered a competitor, that they basically own that sort of medium lift commercial payload market, and most of the government market as well.
Well, can I jump in?
Worked really well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for that, and thanks for the clarification that you're saying technically what we just saw is related to a NASA program, so it's not like they're completely distinct. That's partly why I was so surprised, is because you're right. I had seen footage, I don't know, at this point, was it years ago, where they did successfully land the thing, and it looked like they were playing a video in reverse. Like it looked too good to be true. And then, but people were saying, no, that's a legit video. And so that's why I was so surprised then with this one, when people were congratulating it, and then to learn, oh no, that thing blew up. And so what's the difference between, in other words, they had that last one down so precisely that they could not only not have it blow up, but have it come back and land. And now this one, so what do you know about, what are some of the differences? Yeah.
Sure. So there's a number of differences. So one is it's just a brand new rocket, right? Any new system, you're going to have some bugs to work out, and they have a lot of experience with the Falcon 9, and they've applied some of those learnings to the Starship program, but it's just a new system. The other major difference is that Starship is a much up rocket. I think it's basically the biggest rocket ever made. Up there with the Saturn V, which launched the Apollo missions, and it's a new engines, much bigger. And I think more generally, like a way to think about, rockets are just harder than a lot of other things that we're used to. So if you compare it to, say, a new plane, right? If you're testing a new plane, what they do to test a new plane is they do what's called envelope expansion. So they take the airplane, they set it out on the runway. Looks like it's standing up. Okay, good. Then they'll roll it down the runway, right? They'll have just a taxi test where they roll it down the runway. Any problems there? No. Okay. Then now we're gonna make it go a little faster, right? And they increase the speed, and then we're gonna have it lift off and then touch down, right, really quickly, right? And so they gradually expand the envelope. With a rocket, you can't do that. It's either you fly or you don't, right? And so you basically light all the engines and let it go, and that's how you test these things. And so it's Elon always says excitement guaranteed, one way or the other. So and that's I think part of why it's so challenging.
Okay, so obviously the basic engineering and so forth, they know that, but there is a difference between one a rocket of a certain size, and then to say, well, what if we just slapped on 5 times as many engines under there? It's not clear what changes.
It's a huge number. Yeah. It's a huge number of engines on the bottom. I don't think any other rocket has ever had as many engines.
Okay. Do you know, if you don't know, it's fine. I don't mean to put you on the spot, because I've seen people saying that they may have just self-destructed it. Once they knew that the number of engines were failing, they didn't want it to hit something, so they blew it up intentionally to not hurt anything.
It's possible. I don't know one way or the other. Every rocket that launches has to have a flight termination system on board, which is a like a little like a small explosive really that they can remotely operate that that just pierces the side of the rocket and makes the whole thing blow up. Given the stresses of flight, we'll take care of the rest. And so they do have a system on board for that. I don't know that that was what happened here or not, but that is a possibility.
Okay, so I think you said it already, but let me just reiterate to make sure I understand, because the articles that made me less like cynical or whatever when I was at first saying, what do you mean it was a successful failure? Come on. And they were saying that, like, in other words, nobody thought this thing was they weren't sure how far it was gonna get, and that the idea is they had a bunch of telemetry and whatnot that they learned from this. They had all kinds of they have a lot of data now from a real world, and that in the simulators and the computers and stuff you can do all you want, but until you go out and actually light the thing and see what happens, you're not going to know, because like you said, there's all these different interacting variables and it's a complex system. So their model was, we're going to just keep going and trying and learning from these things, knowing full well that the first few attempts aren't going to be successful, but that's the quickest way to actually get to a successful working design. Is that basically right?
That's right. And actually, they've been testing versions of Starship for years now, right? And they started with just a very a shorter version of just the second stage, right? Just the actual vehicle, the Starship vehicle, and it was called Starhopper maybe. Anyway, it was just like a tiny little water tower size thing, and they basically just translated it. They worked on just getting it off the ground, moving it over, and then landing it. And once they sort of perfected that, then they moved on to the full size Starship vehicle. And so they did some tests, a series of tests, again, same sort of thing. The first several failed, where they tried to launch this thing, not to orbit. They couldn't reach orbit with a single stage, probably, but to altitude. And then they practiced sort of the landing maneuver for the vehicle that might have people or cargo on it at some point. And so and they eventually got to the point where they landed that thing, right? And so so what was unique about this test was this is the first orbital test that used not only the vehicle on top but the booster on the bottom. And so so yes, this is extremely consistent with the entire test program. This is not spin that people have put on it. This has been consistent with how they've tested this thing.
Okay, if we could pull back a little bit and talk. So you had sent me some of your work in these topics, and can you speak? You anticipated a little bit already with what you've said, but just the different, how NASA used to award contracts, and then why they came up with a way that they can harness the innovation and speed of a startup, but yet still accomplish what they want.
Yeah, so this resulted from sort of essentially the retirement of the space shuttle, right? So even as early as say 2000 or so, it was clear that the space shuttle was not going to work forever, and so NASA needed a replacement especially to take cargo and eventually crew to the International Space Station. So we have this space station, which is itself $150 billion structure, right? And the most expensive thing we've ever built as a species in space. And to get people to and from, you need a vehicle, right? And sort of NASA's main vehicle was going offline, the space shuttle. And so they needed a new system, and they didn't have a lot of money, right? And so they awarded something to somebody, and there were some lawsuits, including by SpaceX. But eventually they came up with this system where they were going to do they were like, we don't have a lot of money, so what we'll do is we'll do a fixed price contract where the contractor owns the vehicle afterwards. We'll just pay for the service of using it. It's going to be milestone based, so you hit your milestones, you get a check, rather than all the money at once, or just guaranteed that you pay. And then the other thing is it's going to be based on we're not going to design the thing, because when NASA gets involved in design, they always want more and more safety, and so they just jack up the sort of the safety parameters, and add a lot of analysis and costs. And so they were like, it's got to meet sort of these goals. We're going to set out the goals that we're going to meet with the program and not give you requirements, if that makes sense. So goals versus requirements is sort of the third element. And that is the system that sort of funded the Falcon 9's development program. And that's why, why SpaceX was able to succeed. They probably would not have succeeded without that program. It's, why the US is the clear leader in space today, which, we'd be probably falling behind if had it not been for this. And it's why, SpaceX is launching, more mass to orbit than any other entity on the planet, including, the Chinese government. Mm-hmm. So SpaceX by itself is just such a huge player, because of this. There was another winner of the contract. There's another winner of the contract who failed to meet a milestone early on. And so their contract got canceled. So NASA did the right thing there. And then they awarded another one. And that got to fruition, and it has delivered cargo to the ISS. And then they realized that this model worked really well. They got so much more value for the money that they were doing it. And so NASA's method of operation now is use it on everything. So they did this a sort of similar contract again with commercial crew, which are taking humans instead of cargo to the ISS. They've done it now with the human landing system for the Artemis mission. So to go to the moon, again, like the lander that SpaceX is developing is under a similar style contract. And they've done it for, there's been some space station type contracts as well. That this is like they've hit on something that works. And they want to use it every chance they get. The only time they don't use it is when Congress doesn't want them to use it, right? So a lot of times Congress has put their thumb on the scales and appropriated, much more money to a cost plus program that is written in such a way that it's a foregone conclusion which company will get it. So that's what's happened with NASA's other big rocket, the Space Launch System, which is also playing a role in the Artemis missions to the moon.
Okay, so I'm just curious, like, if you don't know, it's fine, but like, is it that NASA would say, we want some company to deliver, to hit this milestone, and then different companies bid and they go with the low bidder, or is it they say what the price tag is and then they look at respondents who say, yeah, we'd be willing to do that?
I mean, so the way this has worked is that NASA will say, this is the pool of money we have. These are the requirements we have. We're soliciting bids for this, service or like this development project, I guess I should say. And then companies, they do bid. It's not necessarily that they will take the low bidder every time. They do assess the bids on the basis of, management and sort of track record and ability to deliver. But yeah, it has been pretty competitive. And so with the human landing system contract, that has been very contentious because SpaceX came in with the low bid and with a very creative solution to use the upper stage of the rocket as the lander. That that doesn't look like the moon lander you saw from Apollo, right, or from the Apollo program, right, which is like more of a squat buggy type thing, not the rover that was on the moon, but the actual thing that came down and landed. And you had a much more traditional program led by Blue Origin, and they sort of Blue Origin, which Jeff Bezos' company, they partnered with a bunch of other prime contractors. So it was a Blue Origin led, but like supported by a bunch of other American contractors. They called it the national team, and they put out a bid that was higher cost. And NASA was like, they were very sure that they were going to win initially. but yeah, it did not work out that way. NASA was like, well, we have a solution here that would work from SpaceX that is actually lower cost, and so we'll take that one.
Okay, yeah. So I guess just for the big picture for the listeners, so the traditional model is they would just pick one company, one contractor. It's sort of like the stereotype of like how a defense contract would work, and you're going to develop this thing, and then if the contractor keeps coming back years into it when you've already spent hundreds of millions of dollars, it says, oh, we're behind, we need a little bit more money. This is taking, or we came up with this new feature. Wouldn't you want us to do this too? As we get into and then at that point you're already 300 million in 4 years or whatever. You're not just going to say, no, cut them off and then start from scratch with somebody else. And from Congress's point of view, that's money flowing to their constituents, and they've got some big contractor located in their state providing jobs and whatever. It's kind of a win-win all around, except for the taxpayer.
That's right. So the distinction I would make is like who owns the product at the end, right? So these are development programs. So they're subsidizing development of a private market they want to exist, basically. So that's the sort of the newer approach. The traditional approach is we want to own a rocket that can do this, and we're going to hire someone to design and build it for us. But we might change our mind about all kinds of specifications as we go, and so we have to pay the contract. No contractor is going to take a fixed price contract where the customer can change things, on the fly, right? And so with a government owned vehicle, or you definitely probably have to do a cost plus program. So at the end of that, so unlike the Space Launch System, which is like the other big rocket that's under development right now, like it's the government's rocket. Like Boeing and a bunch of other contractors have pieces of it, but it's ultimately the government owns it, and there is no commercial market for it. In part because it's too expensive, but it just wasn't designed with that in mind at all. And so the only way you get a contractor to do that is if you offer to say, we'll pay your costs plus a little extra for, that you can take as profit. And then there's the issue of like these contracts. They're all very complex, and they have like award fees for like good performance. And so it's really shocking how the performance, you could have a rocket that's over budget and behind schedule, and the contractor is like making, scoring like 95% on their performance bonus and getting, a lot of extra money on top.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, of course, as economists, we can see institutionally part of the issue is that, Congress, the incentives aren't there. If Congress gets the same shuttle program but saves $1 billion, it's not that Congress's pay goes up by $1 billion. That they're not like a private company where that's right. Money to them. Like to them, actually, yes. The more money being spent and flowing to their districts or whatever is maybe the metric of success. So I guess that's part of the reason that this kind of stuff happens.
Absolutely, the key senators on the Space Launch System program, for example, were from Florida, from Texas, from other states that had big chunks, Alabama, big chunks of the program were based out of those states, and so some people called it the Senate Launch System instead of the Space Launch System. It was very very much driven by Congress. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a rocket to nowhere. Yeah.
Okay, well, can we maybe take a few minutes then and just speak more broadly about the economics of this? So, I mean, would this have been possible in the 80s if they had said to private companies, you can own the space shuttle? Or was it that, well, no, legally they wouldn't have been able to do anything with it? Has like the law changed to allow for private property rights in space, or, that kind of thing?
It's a great question. I think in terms of like the contracting innovations, I don't think there's anything that is stopping what ever has stopped NASA from doing this. So government agencies are bound by procurement rules, and so if you're doing, we want to at least like make some effort to prevent graft and bribes and so on. So there's pretty extensive contracting rules that all agencies have to abide by. NASA has always had, since its inception in 1958, other transactions authority. So these are called Space Act agreements, and the Space Act agreements, provided that you're not literally doing a conventional procurement and just calling it a Space Act agreement to get around the rules, they have a lot of flexibility. And so this other transactions authority is kind of what makes NASA able to do this, and they've had that authority since their inception as an agency. So there's nothing new there. I think we are at a maybe you could argue we're at a point now where the sort of being able to, like, with a relatively small company, like, do interesting things in space with computers and with better design tools. Like, you can have a pretty lean team that put together an interesting vehicle, right? And so maybe something like that makes it more attractable for the private market. But there's nothing obvious to me that suggests, like, we couldn't have done this before. So yeah, it's a fantastic question.
Oh, okay. But I guess then the flip side is, and this might not be your areas, but do you know, like, have they codified like property rights beyond Earth more now?
So the answer is sort of. So there is an outer space treaty that the U.S. is a signatory to, and it says that there is no. I forget the exact phrasing, but there's something in there that suggests, like, the U.S. can't go and, like, plant a flag on the moon and, like, claim ownership of the moon, right? Mm-hmm. So that's in there. What Congress has done more recently is they've interpreted it, the treaty, to mean that that if you were to go into space and sort of find an asteroid and start mining it, you are entitled to the proceeds of that mining operation, right? So they've clarified that nothing in the Outer Space Treaty, like, prevents that. So I think that for all practical purposes, other than, like, sort of vast landholding, right? Like you have property rights in space, or stuff that you send up and use, and the resources that you acquire while you're there, those are yours. So that's clear. I don't think that that's what has driven SpaceX so much. Still, the vast majority of space revenue is satellites. Mm-hmm. So it's just the vast majority of, like, where the money goes. But I think that is hopefully the future is, establishing settlements in space and sort of, appropriating, in situ resources, right? Like, you have to be able to lay off the land to some extent and own it, be able to make use of the resources that you find there. And I think under the U.S. legal framework, I think that's acceptable. The other quirk here is that under the Outer Space Treaty, anything that is launched is under the supervision of the launching state. So any private company that launches from the U.S. or a U.S. person or whatever, like, the U.S. has both jurisdiction and responsibility for it. So if you're a bad actor and you cause problems to somebody else, to China's spaceship, like, the U.S. is responsible. So there's an incentive to tamp down on maybe the craziest and most dangerous things that people could do in space.
I guess ranging from, like, deliberately putting up, like, a killer satellite that just starts taking out other people's things versus just something that the orbit wasn't right and it starts knocking stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I think space debris is a concern, right? So if you put something up in orbit that was designed to break apart or something like that into a million pieces that are all moving, like Mach 25 is, like, orbital speed, that's dangerous. So that's not allowed.
Okay. I guess partly why I'm asking these questions is because, as you can probably imagine, a lot of the listeners of this podcast, I know, are going to be very free market oriented, and they're going to say, well, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need a government space program. it would just have all have been private. So I think my gut tells me it would not have been an efficient use of resources to go plant a flag on the moon in the late 60s, given the realities and whatever. But I do think, setting up telecom satellites and whatnot in the 80s would have made sense commercially. I'm just wondering what's your gut feel on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I obviously come from a libertarian tradition as well. I've gotten less dogmatic about it over the years, and it really is hard to disentangle in space, right? Like it's very the satellites that we have today. They probably wouldn't have been able to launch without sort of the investments that the U.S. government made, beginning in the 1950s. And without those investments, like you just wouldn't have it. I think about something like the GPS system, right? This is a piece of space that all of us use every day now, right? And those are military systems, the global positioning satellites, and wouldn't have happened without government investment. The sort of the spillover benefits of doing stuff in space, I think are quite compelling. So one challenge that I see as I work on innovation and innovation policy is that we are pretty comfortable down here on Earth, right? There's nothing to really motivate us to get out of our complacency. Right, and in space there's constant danger. There's you're operating under severe constraints and risk, and I think that sort of just that sort of environment of not being complacent has driven quite a lot of innovation over the years. Space was the initial market for solar panels, and which are now thanks a lot in part significantly to private sector innovation now have gotten so cheap that they're going to enable people to live off grid and and so on. So there's all kinds of spillover benefits that occur and from investment in space, and so it's hard for me to take a dogmatic libertarian position here. I think it is valuable to have that investment, and it is investment I think that a lot of times that the private sector probably wouldn't lead. I think that the margin that we should be pushing on is more, well, can we at least do it well? Can we can we make sure that we have more Falcon 9s and fewer space launch systems, right? And sort of have the more successful contracting system that's more than an order of magnitude more effective, and sort of having taking an approach here of let's acknowledge, of course, we're taking money from the taxpayer, but let's try to spend it well and get as much as we can out of it, and that there's obviously a million challenges with that, as you know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and by the way, so folks listening, I'll link to some of Eli's papers. If you go to the show notes for this episode, you can see him make the case, and I think you did make a compelling case, Eli, that given that taxpayer dollars are going to be used to fund these sorts of things, there's smarter and dumber ways of doing it, and you certainly have a good case for your preferred approach. So I guess just again, just the fundamentals of it. One issue would be are there constraints? In other words, right now, it's not that you could say, oh, we could get rid of the Department of Defense and just let the private sector develop things, because it would be illegal. So whether that was a good idea or not, that wouldn't work given the other things the state does, to say if we catch anybody with, more than this kind of a rifle, we're going to put you in jail. And then, so but are you saying right now, are there any legal roadblocks to a private company just going to venture capitalists to put a base on the moon and eventually in Mars? Or are there actually legal hurdles that it would kind of have to be in conjunction with governments?
I think there, fairly. There's always legal obstacles. So, but I think they're fairly contained and minimal in the case of innovating in space. So you need a launch license, right? That's an FAA-led process to approve you to launch. It does you need approval from the State Department, right? Among other things. So they're going to do a payload review to make sure like what you're sending to space again, because the U.S. government is responsible under this treaty.
Yep.
So they're going to make sure that what you're sending to space is okay. But I think if a private company or a private American company or an American individual was like, I'm going to spend, I have this many $1 billion and I'm going to spend it all building a moon base. I think for the most part, the policy environment would be favorable. You might get a little embarrassment from NASA feeling like they've been shown up, but but they're not a regulatory agency anyway. And I think that parts of NASA would think it was great and would want to cooperate and assist. So it is. I think there's it's fairly reasonable and non-deal breaky sort of regulations on this stuff.
So then I guess just as an economist, to justify the existence of government funding for these things, like is there some kind of market failure argument that the private sector is not going to fully capture all the benefits and that's why they wouldn't adequately fund it, and that's why there's at least a prima facie case for taking the money? Like the public wants to fund it and wants there to be a moon base and are willing to spend however many billion to do it, but they couldn't do it through private channels for various reasons.
Yeah, I would say it's a few things. So one is the spillover benefits of inventions made along the way and so on. I think another one is just sort of the science that we've learned from going to space is itself like it's not a commercial benefit, but right, for better or worse, the U.S. Government spends money subsidizing science and basic research and stuff, and we have learned a ton from the different aspects of sort of the space program, from even telescopes on Earth that have been funded by governments, as well as space telescopes and experiments on the International Space Station. I think that the other thing, though, is that this is an area where there are pieces of the puzzle that it only works if some of the pieces are already in place, right? And so you and it's maybe more than one actor can do. And so I think that you can look at the sort of the new wave of NASA contracting as them recognizing, we don't want to control we don't want to operate our own vehicles, right? Like we don't want to own and operate vehicles. We want to buy services on the market. Markets are great, right? The problem is that like the market that we want doesn't exist. And so we are going to subsidize the creation of the market that doesn't exist yet, and be the tentpole customer. But ideally we are not the only customer, right? They don't want to be the only customer in the end. And so, so I think it's sort of like an enlightened view that the service you're going to get is better if you're not the only customer in the end.
Right.
And so they're kind of stepping in with, in these new style contracts, like fairly modest amounts of money relative to what they were spending before, and getting a lot of bang for the buck out of it, and creating markets that I think will snowball and eventually become self-sustaining.
Okay. And just to clarify for listeners, philosophically, I'm against state intervention, but I'm here just to gain from your expertise on this. So I'm not here to we're not having a debate. I'm just curious your view.
Correct.
So with the time we have left, can you speak a bit to, because I'm everybody, the Artemis program going to the moon, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know some of the particulars? Like I had seen earlier timetables. Do you know like right now what the status of that is and what they're saying the reasonable milestones would be?
It's going to be a terrible boondoggle, actually. I think I'm hearing no earlier than 2027 for boots on the moon at this point.
Okay.
So quite.
Is that pushed back from
That's
original?
yeah. So it was initially, well, it's been pushed back many times, but yeah, I think when it was originally announced, it was going to be, I think basically the Trump administration wanted to do it during their first term, right?
Okay.
So it was going to be like 2024. But the design of the program is kind of insane. So like the sort of the architecture of the mission was they were going to have this really big, expensive rocket that nobody wants except for the United States Senate, and they're going to put humans on the capsule on the top of it, and launch that, and then the capsule would get to the moon and orbit the moon, and then they're going to. The next step of the architecture is have a space station that's there orbiting the moon that they're going to build for this purpose, transfer people from the capsule to the space station, and then transfer them to a lander system that takes them from the space station to the surface of the moon, and then back up to the space station when they're done with their activities on the moon, and then back to Earth. And so it's kind of crazy because the space launch system is going to be about $2 billion per launch. So so just an insane amount of money. And then we're going to launch like the Starship, which is another like sort of competing rocket that is not human rated or anything like that yet, but could be, certainly by 2027 it could be. And and so we're going to transfer people from one vehicle to another when the other one is like much cheaper and better. Certainly by 2027 it will be a lot better. And then on top of that, we're going to build a space station orbiting the moon, which the space station that orbits Earth is the most expensive structure humanity has ever built, $150 billion. And so it's a crazy approach. I've heard people say things like that maybe it's possible that the lunar gateway, the space station that's orbiting the moon, will get written out of the plan, and they'll just have docking between the capsule and Starship in lunar orbit. But it's a crazy way to do it, and sort of the obvious way to do it would be keep working on Starship, the one that just blew up. Keep working on that until we're confident it can carry humans, and then just put humans on there, take them to the moon, land, and then come back all in one vehicle. It would make a lot more sense. It would. So one of the things that is going to be required for any of these missions is for the Starship vehicle to refuel on orbit. So they're going to launch it to orbit, and then it'll be the first time a vehicle has refueled, or that kind of vehicle has refueled on orbit. And so that is still a technical challenge that will need to be met in any case. But
why is that necessary? I'm missing the.
So the way that you get more payload, the way you get payload to a very far destination is you just burn more fuel, right? So you have a higher fraction of the mass that you can carry is made up of fuel.
Right.
And so what this means is that you can have a rocket like the Saturn V, I think could take like 130 tons or something like that to low Earth orbit. But it could only take 4 tons to the moon, because the remaining difference was fuel. And so the way that SpaceX is solving this is they're saying, okay, no problem. We won't take up all that space with fuel, but we'll just refuel.
Okay, so
when we get to orbit,
they'll bring the fuel up first.
They'll send fuel tankers up to orbit,
I got you.
and then dock in orbit and refuel. And so this means that they'll be able to take 150 tons of payload, not just to the moon, but to Mars, right? And so that's what they've designed it to be. And Starship is going to be just so incredibly cost effective if they achieve their targets of full reusability, refuelability on orbit, and so on. Like it is going to open up space like never before.
And is my intuition right that like the hard part is escaping Earth's, getting away from Earth, but then like to go from here to Mars, you just kind of got to point in direction and fire for a little bit, and then you get slingshotted. It's not like your engines are burning going to Mars. the whole time.
Not the whole time. That's right.
Okay.
There will be additional thrust maneuvers and stuff when you get to Mars, because you've got to slow down.
You got to slow down and get into orbit or whatever you're doing.
They don't have very much atmosphere, so you can't use atmospheric braking. So yes, there'll be some fuel expenditure there, but that's right.
I have to ask. So, some people are going to say, what the heck? This is, if they went to the moon in the late 60s, why is this so hard? Like, going to Mars, sure, but why like, are they using different technology, or like, did they forget? What's going on?
Yeah, I think some of it is we've kind of forgotten some aspects of it. We don't have the muscles to do it.
Meaning institution, like the engineers who did it,
yeah.
They're retired or dead, and so like some of it you can't just look at a blueprint and do it if you didn't actually work on it. Is that what you mean?
Sort of. I think it's also, I think a lot of our graduate students could do big chunks of kind of what they did on the Apollo missions, right? We've learned so much. We've got the computational resources are so good that I wouldn't say that it's just like literal knowledge. It's more the institutional muscle memory and and just sort of the culture of aerospace. It really changed. I think an example I think about a lot is test pilots. So in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, we lost a lot of test pilots. It was really heartbreaking for their families and so on. But we went through tons and tons of test pilots in aviation, right? And today we just don't do that. We can't, right? And it's just not considered okay. And so we have to get to like a more mature design, or have an unmanned version of it before we do that. And so that's that. You sort of take that observation and then like apply it to space, right? Where obviously you can be unmanned, for initial rocket launch or something like that. But it's just the safety culture has gotten more intense. The just more generally, the move fast and break things attitude that we had sort of early in the space program is gone. And it's been, 50 years, right, since a human has been on the moon. So it's quite a lot, quite a long time. And I think also, like the reason for going, back then it was like a geopolitical project, and we don't have that exact reason anymore. And so we have to think about what makes sense in terms of our presence there, and is there something that is more than planting a flag that we should be doing?
Okay, well, thanks, folks. My guest this week has been Eli Dourado. Eli, thank you for your time and your insights. I'm sure we got a lot out of it.
Thanks. It was super fun for me.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.